Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here. Although I cannot really stick around for as much as I would want to because of some family issues and teaching commitments, but I'm happy to present to you something about history of games and history in games in the Czech Republic. Um, I'm from the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I'm also a member of this research group called Prague Game Production Studies, which is one of the groups that do game studies, game scholarship in this country. Not the only one, but I'll be mostly talking, on behalf of our group at Charles University. Okay, so we don't only do research of historical games or history in games. We do generally game production studies. We're looking at game industry internationally and also locally. But this is just some basic information about the group. But we're also interested in how, spaces of the Czech Republic and Czechia are represented in local games, not only in historical games, but also in contemporary games. And that also brings us to these examples of how the local history is presented in local games. So just to kind of give you an overview of the talk. So first I'll be talking about, history in Czech games, and I'll be talking about the history of Czech games. And I've just prepared this, a little chart here. I mean, this is not the exhaustive list of local games that take place in local history, but they're just some of them, right? So there's this tradition of local games with medieval themes. Kingdom Come Deliverance is of course like the most famous example, which is relatively recent. But then, inspired by Kingdom Come Deliverance, there is this new game called 1428 Shadows over Silesia, which is this kind of fantasy historical hybrid. It's not like super realistic medieval game, not at all. There are like monsters there and zombies and things like that. But it is definitely inspired. It's set in like this alternative kind of fantasized history, but it's definitely inspired by the success of Kingdom Come Deliverance, and I think that this might become like a larger trend. It's a really interesting game. And in the course of our research into local game industry, we're doing interviews with developers, and we have already done an interview with the main designer of 1428 Shadows over Silesia. But then, like if we go further into history of local games, then we will find even older examples of this, like the game Husita from 1998, which is a strategy game. I actually haven't played it. Maybe I should. Some of you have played it. I mean, it's definitely like an interesting part of local game history. And even before that, in the 1980s, there were computer games taking place in a medieval Czech time, especially like the Husit era, which is just like, even in high schools, is taught as this like very important part of Czech history. So that's kind of one part of it. Then we have educational games about more recent Czech history or Czechoslovak history. And these two games, Attentat and Svoboda, are made by Charles Games, which is an independent studio kind of partially owned by Charles University. And Vítězslav from that studio will actually be talking to you tomorrow. So I won't really talk about his games. He can do it himself. And these are award-winning, excellent educational games about history. And I'm really proud that we have this here at Charles University and like in the Czech Republic in general. And then probably like the games that I'm most interested in personally are games that portray even more recent history. And these are not games that we would kind of traditionally label as historical games. Someday the Return is like this first person, I guess, survival horror thriller adventure game, but it takes place in the Czech countryside, and it's a Czech countryside that's like very much marked by the architecture of the 1970s and 1980s and the experiences of people during that era. Hrot, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a first-person shooter game that takes place in 1980s Czechoslovakia. So this Soviet-era Czechoslovakia. It's very grotesque in a way. There's a lot of kind of material culture reproduced as like these simple 3D models. It looks very retro, but it's a recent game. It's being developed now. and it's been very successful, both within the country and outside of the country. And it's very funny. I really kind of recommend that you play it. And not only that, this kind of, we could say nostalgia, like this nostalgia after, the socialist era. You can see it in many other games as well. There's a game called Last Holiday in development right now, which takes place in the year 2000. So it's even more recent, but it's treated as a history of sorts. It's treated as this time when everything was possible and people could be kind of mean to each other, and there was like politically incorrect humor everywhere, and you could do whatever you wanted. This is in development, and you can see that there's like this typical marker of like socialist era, Eastern Europe, the Trabant car, and you'll be part of the gameplay of that game is tuning of this Trabant car. So definitely, even like games that are not like explicitly historical do somehow kind of relate to the history of the region. So yeah, so that was one part of it. We have published a piece specifically about Someday You'll Return, and also the game The Medium, which takes place in Poland, and takes place in this kind of abandoned hotel in Poland. So it takes place, specifically in a historical building in Poland, and it kind of relates and speaks a lot about Polish history. And this is open access, and you can read it. So that's like the first part of our research into these representation of local spaces in Eastern European games. And then, so the other part that I want to talk about is history of games in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. I've written a book called Gaming the Iron Curtain, which was published in 2018 and is going to be published in the Czech language next year, hopefully. It's taking a long time. It's a pretty thick book based on interviews and archival materials such as old magazines and computer club newsletters and so on. It's based on my dissertation originally. So like I lived with it for a long time, and I still continue to live with it. So you can check it out. I'll just kind of do some. I'll take a few bits from that in a moment. Before I go into details, I want to talk a little bit about just the kind of general kind of overview. I mean, there are many ways in which we can create like a chronology of history of games here. But let's say this is one option, right? So in the 1980s, games are mostly played at homes or in state-sponsored computer clubs because there's no software or hardware market. There's homebrew production, and there are activist games, which I'll talk about, kind of anti-government activist games. But there's no market, so people mostly make games for free, and they give them away to their friends. So that's mostly what my book is about. Then in the 1990s, we start seeing this semi-professional production, mostly initially for the local computer game market. So at first, you could actually make enough money to by just selling games within Czechoslovakia, basically. And an example of that would be Dračí Historie, and similar adventure games from the 90s. So these were in Czech. They were very often dubbed in Czech, so they had Czech voiceovers. They contained a lot of cultural references that were local, and they were primarily aimed at the local audience. Then the industry starts to change globally, and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the rising costs of development necessitate orientation towards international markets. It's no longer possible to make a good quality game and only sell it in the Czech Republic or Slovakia, right? You kind of have to expand. And we had some success stories there, games like Operation Flashpoint, which became, internationally, or at least within Europe, very popular and commercially successful. The Mafia, right, series started in 2002. So these were some of like the early examples of international successes of the local game industry. And soon after that, we see this movement towards multinational companies buying up or investing or entering various kinds of deals with local studios. In 2007, Illusion Softworks, who made Mafia, were purchased by Take-Two Interactive and became 2K Czech, right? They became basically like a daughter company of this multinational. And this is something that's ongoing. And I will also get back to that. So this was the general overview. And now I want to talk a little bit about what we have available. And I will sort of go from like from the 80s onwards, but mostly focus on the 1980s because that's kind of what I'm most competent in. So in terms of what has been preserved, so I've mentioned magazines and club newsletters. Definitely some of them have been preserved. There are fans and nonprofits that are kind of trying to gather them and digitize them and so on. I won't really be talking about them too much today, but I want to mention the games themselves. I mean, games as pieces of software. So from before 1989, more than 300 individual titles have been preserved, which I think is a lot. I think it's a pretty good number. It speaks to the prolific nature of the local homebrewers, and it also speaks, I think, to the activists, to the fan archivists, right, and their efforts, because they're really kind of dedicated to this. It's still kind of difficult to decide, like, what do we include in this number? Like, do we include ports, for instance? A lot of the pieces of software that were made here, and especially in the 90s, were ports of existing British games, for example, for local platforms or for platforms that were popular locally. Do we count them as Czechoslovak games? Maybe we should. I'm not really sure. And then another interesting question that I think will maybe has been mentioned in the contribution about Slovakia. What do we do about Czechoslovakia? You know, like, do we just kind of try to own like our common history, like each of us, or how do we do that? Because like many of the games from the 1980s, it's kind of sometimes hard to say whether they will Czech or Slovak, right? Maybe they were both. It's kind of hard to say. I've pulled out this little statistic, which is from the upcoming Czech version of my book, so it's very new, and it's a statistic showing the number of preserved games for the Spectrum and Atari platforms, and it's a comparison between like these countries that you can see here. Right, and based on this, this is from the Spectrum Computing and Atari Mania fan databases, and you can see that even compared to Poland, which is in terms of population 4 or 5 times bigger country, the Czechoslovak scene was very, very prolific, right? Like the homebrew scene was very, very strong here. So it's more, yeah, we have more games preserved than Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, not much has been done in terms of institutional preservation of this heritage. So we can call it, of course, digital cultural heritage, all these old computer games. And mostly the preservation has been in the hands of individuals, nonprofits, and fans. I've spoken to various institutions many times, with the Czech Technical Museum and the Czech Technical Library in the past, and like they were always like, this is interesting, but like we don't really have like funding for it, or we don't have people for it. So like not much progress had been made in institutional preservation. There are, though, these fan databases. Some of them are officially supported by our local industry association. That is visiongame.cz, which is called the Archive of Czechoslovak Games and Developers. And they explicitly say Czechoslovak, right? Because they're also kind of trying to own like the common history here. It's a really useful archive. It's online. It doesn't include like the software for the most part, but it's really useful. Then we have these platform-focused archives, online archives, like this one, the Czechoslovak Speky archive, meaning these they collect games for the ZX Spectrum, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum computer. It's an invaluable resource for my research, at least. It's put together by fans, and in that archive, because it's kind of legally dubious, we could say, and they don't really care, you can actually download all the software from there. Then there are non-profit archives like Herní Archiv, but we have a representative of that, so he can tell you about it. So non-profits that are collecting all these materials and games and magazines, scanning them and so on. And lately, there has been this effort, and I hope it will be successful, to institutionalize support for games preservation. And there has been a joint grant application by the National Film Archive, FAMU, which is the film and TV school of the Academy of the Performing Arts. They have a game design program, which I also teach at. It's a great program. And Czech Technical University. So these three institutions came together, filed a grant application to develop basically methods and procedures for preserving computer games as pieces of cultural heritage. Jan Kremer is also involved, and I think maybe RS. No, yeah, but more people are involved. It's a very kind of big group of people, and we hope that he will get this grant. Okay, so I have about 5 minutes, so I'll just kind of try to pinpoint some interesting tidbits from the history of games in Czechoslovakia. Okay, I will probably skip this, but you know, in the 1980s, many of the games that were produced here were inspired by Western sources, right? And it still kind of persists, like Star Fox, which has nothing to do with Star Fox by Nintendo. It was made by Cybex Lab Software, which sounds very fancy, but it's just basically one guy in Suchdol, in Prague 6 Suchdol. And locals are laughing because they know that Suchdol is a very insignificant suburb of Prague, right? So that's Star Fox. And, you know, people were inspired by Western popular culture. Games about Indiana Jones were being made. At the same time, though, there were games that had these local inspirations, inspired by local comics, like Rychlé šípy. Actually, Rychlé šípy, it's about this kind of group of kind of Boy Scouts-like group of boys. It was actually banned in the 1980s. It wasn't, they couldn't publish it, right? But a game about it could actually be published because there was no regulations or censorship of computer games in the 80s. Yeah, and we had this is Dobývání hradu, taking the castle from 1986. So this, we could say, is like the predecessor to Kingdom Come in a way. It takes place, it takes place in in a medieval castle in southern Bohemia in the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken. You know, it's a text adventure game, as most of these which I'm showing here are, right? And also we had these autobiographical games. Yeah. Some interesting trends in game development in the 1980s were, one of them were hyperlocal games, and the other were activist games. Hyperlocal games, I define them as games created by people from a particular place about that place. So it's a bit similar to like the some of the games I already mentioned, like Someday You'll Return or The Last Holiday or things like that. So it's games that take place in a particular place, made by people from that place. Just to give you one example, there were dozens of them made in the 80s and the 90s. This is a game called TOL. It takes place in this like weird factory, and I didn't know what it was about. And there's this kind of guy with glasses verbally abusing you the whole time you're playing the game. And I wondered what it's about and where it takes place. You're this little guy, and your goal is to just like start some machinery. So I got in touch with the author, Mr. Zlamo, who told me that it takes place in Teplárna Olomouc, the Olomouc heating plant. And so it takes place in a real factory, or I mean, the real kind of heating plant. He worked there, and the guy is the shift foreman, so he was his boss. The game was made for the entertainment of the author himself and his colleagues and his shifts, I guess. But then it kind of spread into like the general audience, and yeah, now we kind of don't really know what to do about it. But like it was this kind of hyper local game. So another trend that I want to mention is activist games, and there were, depending on how we count, there were a handful, like let's say 5 or 6 such games made in the late 80s, and one of them is The Adventures of Indiana Jones in Wenceslas Square in Prague on January 16th, 1989, which is a game in which Indiana Jones finds himself on Wenceslas Square during an anti-government demonstration, which actually took place. And your goal is to escape Wenceslas Square, but you're getting beaten up by by secret police and by the people's militia and by police in general, and you have to fight back. It's a very brutal game. You die a lot, but you also kill those policemen. It's a text adventure game, and it's just one example. It's a reaction to this violence that took place at a real demonstration. So in a way, it was a kind of this activist response to the events, and I was really kind of struck by this phenomenon. It really hasn't been documented anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe there was something like that, but it hasn't really been documented. But we do have 5 or 6 games like that in Czechoslovakia, and many of these are not available to, or I mean, they're not playable for people from outside the country, and so we decided to translate this game into English, and it's available on the website of my book, and I can just like you'll see, or I can show you later. So you can play it in English, actually. Similar efforts have been taking place in Slovakia, where actually I think a dozen of games have been translated into English, and you can now play them in English. And I think it's amazing for for the purposes of comparative history of games. I think it's amazing. Just maybe I have a bit of time, some stuff from the 90s. I think that sometimes there's this kind of false assumption that the 90s were the period of PC games, but not only PC games, right? There were commercial companies in the 1990s in Czechoslovakia that were putting out games for 8-bit computers, still on cassette tapes. Games like The Name of the Rose, which is a really weird game. It's a combination of The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, but also there's Inspector Clouseau from the Pink Panther, and there are references to Tutti Frutti, the erotic German TV show. It's pretty, and also, I mean, other cultural references. It's pretty crazy, and it's also for adults only. These games were being released commercially in the 1990s, and they kind of reflect this newfound freedom of the 1990s, right? Like this international pop cultural references and erotic content and things like that. Games on tapes were released as late as 1995. This is actually a Slovak game, so sorry, Slovak team Slovakia. I'm using a Slovak example here, but as late as 1995. Games were being released on cassette tapes. Yeah, I've already talked about Dragon History of Flashpoint. There are some notable recent games here, but I think you're probably familiar with many of these. Maybe you don't know they're Czech. Beat Saber is Czech, right? American Truck Simulator is Czech. And probably the latest developments is what I've already hinted at, this consolidation of game industry has also affected the Czech game industry. So you can see that Czech gaming studios are being acquired, or shares of them are being sold to these international companies like Facebook, especially THQ Nordic and Embracer. All of these kind of big conglomerates are buying up or investing into Czech companies. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.